Hello and welcome to another episode of Denusion. This one, I hope, I don't know. I have big expectations for this episode, Jeremy. Before I introduce you, I don't know. I've been looking forward to this. Usually I get to talk to people that I am really excited to learn from. And I think you and we met only a few weeks, maybe a month ago on social media, of all things, a social media relationship. um where like I think we both realized that we're like best friends, but our lives have never really collided yet. So I'm really excited for this conversation to really I don't know, it's like a I don't even know how to describe it. Like, are we best friends? Like I felt like I was in Step Brothers where we just looked at each other like, are we best friends? Well, anyways, thanks for being here with us. Jeremy Dumphy and his wife Clara Osborne, they run Pasture Song Farm up in Pennsylvania, in the fine state of Pennsylvania. You guys, if I understand, raise chickens and pigs and veggies and flowers and crops, that is grains, which will, I think, be the conversation that we really focus on today. But Jeremy, why don't you start us off? Thanks for being here, first off. Second off,
Yep.
just give us a little background on yourself. Who are you? What do you guys do? We'll go from there.
All right. I will. I'll correct you. No veggies. Um, Flowers
Ooh.
instead of veggies. But yeah. So my wife and I started farming together at the place we're at here in Pennsylvania, leasing the ground. We don't own it. Uh, in 2015, I believe. I mean, I come from a farming background. My parents run a dairy about 15 minutes down the road from us, so it's not cold turkey here. But yeah, so now the farm has evolved a little bit over the years, of course. And but yeah, chickens, pigs. It started as pigs. We really focused on that to get us going. And then poultry, chickens, and my wife's flower business. And basically the impetus was for that was to just grow the business so she could stay on the farm the whole time, because I was still working off the farm when we started, pretty much full time. Now I still work off the farm a bit, but only as much as I need to. And what else do we do? Yeah, the grains and hay, and we can talk about why we decide to do all those things. It seems like a lot, but our key ethos, I guess, is a rotation. And it's not that we're making this up. I mean, those are rotations in agriculture are as old as agriculture. So, and whatever you want to timestamp you want to put on that. And so for us, it was just about. It really came about because of the pigs. Raising pigs outside is a challenge, and they're not gentle, and our environment isn't gentle. I'd say our land here is very dynamic. It's like highly productive, and so a system of like really dynamic agriculture works well. And the only way to get that is with a rotation. So
Mm.
yeah, but that's what we do. Two kids. We also raise some beef. We have a small beef herd, but most of our beef operation is dairy bulls that we raise from 2 days old as bottle calves, and then we finish them out. So that's sort of the latest project we're on in terms of the farm, because
Right.
just trying to offer all three of those things. We sell most of our products retail at a farmer's market and through kind of like a meat share or CSA, whatever you want to call it. Um, yeah, a little bit of wholesale, and that's us.
We met on social media. Um,
Yeah.
there was an individual farm that you're more than welcome to name. I'll let you do it. That was really, they were posting this reel on Instagram that was showing the degradation, the erosion, the flooding after a great rain event on their neighbor's property, which was corn, soy, wheat, peanuts, whatever it was, but like a tilled monoculture. It was the idea. And then it flashed back to their own property, and it was to some degree covered with some, small grasses and such. And it was supposed to be this contrasting, look at the idea of modern conventional agriculture with a rain event. It loses its soil, it loses the minerals in the soil, it leaches, fertilizer, etc. The land is eroding is the idea. And then look at this regenerative agriculture, which is obviously so much better, as we are taught and infused to learn. And in your comment, I remember seeing it and I looked right at my wife. I very rarely scroll Instagram. I find it to be a very negative practice for my own life. But I was doing it, I was scrolling and I saw it and I saw your comment. And immediately I was like, Morgan, I have to DM this guy. Like he's going to see it as the weirdest, like and I sent you a message, something like, I saw your comment. I think we're going to be best friends. We have to talk. And then, it's gone from there. But I think if I can get to the gist of your comment, it had something to do with, so this farm that was posting the video that was really demeaning and reducing conventional agriculture down to something that was entirely 110% negative as an ecological reality. Also purchases great amounts of grains grown in those environments to feed their own farm. And you were acknowledging this in your comment, and I just want to start there. I think in this regenerative agricultural farming, sustainable, organic, permaculture, biodynamic, however you want to approach it, this modern green farming movement that has been constructed under the mythos that we are saving the world through agriculture, there is an unspoken dynamic there that still entirely relies on importing grains or nourishment or seeds or nutrients or fertilizers from the conventional system in order to make that inherent quote unquote regeneration work in that place. So I want to start there.
Yeah.
There's no question. I just want to lay the floor, see where you take that,
Yeah.
and then I'll follow you.
Yeah. So I'll just tell you what bugs me about it, and why I even feel the need to make a comment like that. A, it's a farm that is not going to lose any business based on my comment. So, I'm not some troll on the internet. Like, someone just trying to make it work. No, I'm not going to do it. But this has been a repeated thing that I have noticed in the movement as well. And just to give some background, my parents' dairy is organic. It's been organic since the 80s. They weren't always involved. But so I have some context on how an alternative movement builds and creates a market. And, there's going to be messaging around that. There's going to be the reasons why the farmers actually adopt that. And, the organic industry is far from perfect, but there's no arguing with what it's built itself into. But we can leave that to the side. So that's kind of the context I'm coming from. And so when I see, well, the first thing I see is when I see a post like that, it's incredible. It's just wholesale disingenuous because when you're comparing a field that has grown grain for harvest and storage and then later feeding to a field that is just a pasture, like you're not even comparing the same thing, right? And so unless you're saying we should never grow any grain, just period, like we shouldn't eat grain, we shouldn't feed it to animals, we shouldn't grow it for humans, we should just get rid of grain, which is like, to me it's crazy because that's been the fundamental pillar of human flourishing since the Mesopotamians, maybe. I don't know the history there, but I mean, we're talking about something like we can be critical of it at the same time as not doing what this post did, right? We can say, well, maybe we grow too much grain. Like, okay, fair enough. We can have that conversation, but that's not what's happening. We're taking a look at a pasture that maybe has cows in it grazing, and we're taking a look at a cornfield. And so, yeah, like I said, it's just not even the same thing. If we wanted to make a real post about that, what you would do is you'd take a look at a cornfield that was just eroding. And like, don't get me wrong, that picture that I was commenting on, that is horrible. I'm never advocating for that kind of erosion. Like, people were posting on there too, like, oh man, they really need a cover crop. That field needed way more than a cover. Like, that's not even a Band-Aid. That's like a little kid's Band-Aid on a amputation, It needed terracing. It needed but also that problem didn't happen yesterday. That problem has been decades in the making, like where those waterways were flowing through that field, et cetera. So I just want to preference that. Like, I'm not advocating to just denude the earth with agriculture, but we do have to have a real conversation about, okay, we're not getting rid of grain. That's ridiculous. So what do we want it to actually look like? And what should have happened in that post is it should have been, hey, this is where we buy grain, and look at the field after the same amount of rain or something like that. The same crop, let's compare apples to apples. And I don't know, like lately when I think of regeneration or regenerative movement or any of that sort of thing, I'm just much less interested in the practices that people are engaged in. And I feel this really hard push to define regenerative based on praxis or based on practices, and using that as some sort of proxy, because we can reduce it down to a measurement, and we're very reductionistic in the West, and so that's how we think. But really, that's not what regeneration is. I mean, the outcome is what's important. And so if you're not, and I'm not even interested in measurable outcome. I mean, it can be people's happiness. It can be, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on all this, but like, why take a picture of your neighbor's field eroding as a marketing ploy to sell your product, as opposed to like putting your phone down, going and talking to him and saying, hey, we'd like to buy your grain. We can give you $3 a bushel more to help you fix this field. Like, why isn't that the post? I don't know. I mean, it's just relationships. And as opposed to a coming together of relationships, it's a divisive thing. It's like I just don't know what the goal is of a post like that. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're good. How much do you think I have to ask this right? So, like, I had a conversation recently that aired on this podcast with Haddon Turner, an agrarian writer out of the UK. And he made the comment that his life goal is to be a celebrity within 15 miles of his home. And I loved that. I love that idea that localism in some true sense is to forsake this idea that has been placed upon us by like our social media masters, that this farm has any reach beyond their local environment. Because if my reach extends beyond that environment that is local to me, then I have to like nurture that reach. But in nurturing that reach, I forget about what is home. Like I forget about what my neighbor is thinking and doing and how they perceive me and how my relationship affects them if my mind is always trying to convince somebody in another state to buy my products. So in some degree, coming home is like the eradication, working, in a community, that is to say, is really this eradication of like social realities in any sort of technological or industrial sense. But like, how much do you think this problem has its roots in modern accessibility of being able to buy your grains from anywhere? And really, this question stems from there's this brilliant book. It's called Becoming Kin. It was written by an Anishinaabe writer. Hetty Quarick, I think is her name. And she made the comment that what a different world it would look like if reparations weren't done, between the modern world and indigenous peoples, that is, weren't done on a person by person basis, but if every church and state government were to return the land they have back to the indigenous people that used to live on that land, and then they became a tenant. And if they became a tenant on that land, how different their lives and actions would be. And it was a really interesting question in terms of indigenous reparations and everything else. But I think it also extends to us here. If this farm had to rely on a relationship with their neighbor in order to succeed, they would necessarily have to be a good tenant in the landscape. And they would have to start participating with their neighbor, right? Because they need grains, the neighbor produces grains, so that relationship is more or less determined in that sense. So the question, I guess, is, I don't know, it's like, how much of our modern world owes itself to the social pressure of trying to be everything to everyone?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think that to focus in on the grains here, I think that it is a maybe a narrative crutch, if that makes sense, where it's been used as a narrative crutch for people getting started. Because the reality is, not everyone is going to grow. Like, if you want to raise a couple hundred chickens, even a couple thousand chickens, not everyone is going to. Like, I'm not advocating that everyone grow everything they need, this like, insane self-sufficiency or something like that. Because I do think, like you're saying, the community is really important, and communities are going to look different. I mean, this country is huge, and communities are definitely going to look different. But we have this commodity grain system, and the price is very similar in Pennsylvania as it is in Florida, as it is in California, et cetera. There's going to be small regional differences, but by and large, the Chicago Board of CME is the acronym. Sets the price for these things. So it's a huge commodity. So it's not work really to just call a feed mill and say, I need grain for my animals. And it gets left out of the conversation for that reason. I will say there was a response to my comment that said something along the lines of that they started getting their grain from a local farmer. That wasn't always the case, because this was like the fourth of many of the same comment that I've made over the past 5 years, I would say. As that was evolving, and that's fine. Like that's what it should do. And maybe you do have to, you're starting something, and you do have to just get your whatever it is, grain, boxes, whatever you need for your input for your farm, or any business for that matter. You have to just make it work, because that's the most important thing, is making it work. But then as you refine it down, like, okay, now we get more and more intentional and more locally minded, maybe, or whatever your ideology is. But the rub for me has always been when just the dishonesty of that, and it makes people feel guilty sometimes, even like, there are people who are the figureheads of these movements, not talking about the struggle that they have. Like, it's universal. Like, there's a universal thing that we deal with. And it shouldn't be some weird, shameful, like, buying grain to feed your chickens should not be shameful. So I don't know why we don't talk about it, or where it comes from, or how it can play a role. I feel like that's what regenerative agriculture is. And I'm not really getting to your question, sorry, about that switch in the onus of responsibility in some ways, But I think that,
No,
yeah. No, go ahead.
no, I was just going to interrupt you and say I think you are getting to it. I really do. I think there's this, as you said, this strange onasm in this regenerative world of ours, where we have been taught to believe that this conventional commodity grain market that grows monocrops, in nutrient deficient soils, etc., is the enemy. And we've created a binary system where we see good and evil, conventional or regenerative, using the phrase regenerative and conventional, as these polar opposites. And
Yeah.
agriculture in its modern way is negative, but agriculture in a regenerative way is always positive. And regeneration, according to Gabe Brown and Ray Archuleta and all of these other thinkers, these leaders in this movement, scientifically inclined leaders in this movement, they're all pushing for, large amounts of cover crops and perennial species and all of these other things. Like, I'll never forget one time I was teaching a course, and it was after Gabe Brown wrote his book, Dirt to Soil, which is one of the more popular books in this space. Amazon has thousands and thousands of reviews. I mean, other agriculture books have hundreds at the most. I mean, it's truly a leader from a narrative and literature perspective in this space. But in the book, he talks, that is Gabe, the author, talks a lot about annual crops, roots in the soil that he's planted and nurtured and found to help, build the soil, like cover crops and things like this. And I was teaching a course years ago, and one of the students was telling, it was a grazing course, holistic planned grazing type, managed grazing type course. And one of the students made the comment about how this course is ill structured, because according to Gabe Brown, you need to have annual, warm season cover crops, whatever they are, in the pastures to be breaking free the compaction and aerating the soil and increasing all of the things that we know and love scientifically in the soil food web and such. And I replied, I said, no, I think it's just roots in the ground. Like, I don't think it has anything to do with annuals. I think annuals could be a tool that we could use to no-till drill out into the pasture to do the things that you speak about. But it's not necessary. It's not linear. But I think we're so trained to believe that it is linear because we haven't really experienced a different narrative. I mean, it's the narrative of Western civilization. It's the narrative we were born into, not to get lost in the weeds there. But it was interesting, right? I texted Gabe during the course. I texted him. I said, okay, you had an option. You have perennial grass in a field. You have annual cover crops as seed in the feed barn, let's call it. What do you do? Do you no-till drill out the annual species, or you just manage the grass better, the perennial species that you do have? And he replied back instantly, oh my God, absolutely. Manage the perennial grasses. Every time, perennial grass is going to build soil much faster than annuals. And it occurred to me in that moment that the student had read Dirt to Soil, and all they learned was annual plants in the soil will decompact, aerate, and do the things we need, build soil. But never in that book was it talked about perennial, agriculture in any sort of way. because the book is written to a certain person, right? And the student wasn't that person. And so what I'm getting at here is, from the leaders to the writers to everyone else in between, like you and I, this whole regenerative movement is entirely structured from a social and linear perspective, as I see it. It's social in the sense that, like, Zach Bush at Farmer's Footprint and everything else, like, you just look in and he has like 5, I don't know, different nonprofits that all do little different things within the movement, and it's so social, and there's hundreds of thousands of followers, in that, and they're telling stories from a perspective, and they're doing really good work, but it's really social in that regard. It has nothing to do with calling up your neighbor, asking them, hey, listen, how can we work together? How can we help? But it's also linear in the perspective that we've been taught from the beginning, that there's good agriculture and bad agriculture, there's regenerative agriculture, and then there's everything else. And to me, the social aspect of it sits on top of all of that, like this rude master, this unnecessary umbrella, where with that umbrella, our eyes can't see the nuance, the great complexity. Like you're saying, if you want to feed grains to your chickens, do it. Don't feel bad about it. But we have to talk about it. Where are these grains coming from, etc.?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many different levels there that I want to talk to you about.
Well, and I think the biggest problem that the regenerative movement, and we can talk about what that is or define it a little bit, as far as I can see it, and maybe where it is right now, is that they actually don't know what to do about grains. They just don't know what to do about them, so they don't talk about
No,
them.
but you're not wrong. We're a hub with the Savory
Yeah.
Institute. We work with their team quite often, and we deploy what's called ecological outcome verification, EOV, which is like a scientific infused or acclimated ecological monitoring protocol that looks at regenerative outcomes in the landscape. And
Mhm.
in every meeting I've been a part of globally with scientists from 5, 10, 15 different universities, PhDs in botany and ecology and sustainability and all these other things. Absolutely right. Somebody will say, why
Yeah.
can't we do EOV, ecological outcome verification, in a cropland? And they just throw their hands up. They're like, we don't know what to do with croplands. Like, so not
Yeah.
only does the movement not know, but the scientists infusing the movement have no idea. So keep going, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, they don't. Well, and it's not until I wish I had it. I had it pulled up. I should have. But we're part of a soil health benchmark study. Essentially, I guess the benchmark is it's just looking at trying to be very specific and catalog our practices. It's very scientific and empirical and all this stuff. But I mean, whatever. Yeah, it's good enough, and there's no other way to do this. And so they're trying to put some science to some of these things. The organization is PASA. I don't know if you've heard of them, but
Mm-hmm.
Pennsylvania
Yep.
Association. I think that's what it's called now, PASA farming. And so they come out and they look at 4 of our fields, and those fields are all part of of our rotation, which would have hogs on them, annual grasses, at least 2-3 years of pasture, whether for hay or for grazing, and then like hardcore annuals with full tillage, like corn and soybeans, like those awful plants. And because, it just works for our system because hogs and chickens eat grain. And if we want to raise both of those species outside, it's just a beautiful rotation to have because eventually you accumulate nutrients. Like if you're only importing the most nutrient dense, well, the most nutrient dense thing would be the meat that we export off the farm. But the second most nutrient dense thing is the grain that they're eating and the minerals that are going out in the soil. Like you just can't in perpetuity. I mean, what's the point? It's just not the best in my mind. It's not the best to just forever have these animals. And like I said, you have to keep in mind for our context, it's very dynamic and very productive soil. And so things are tight and like we try to manage them as best we can. But, I'm not talking about some semi-arid climate where like basically doing nothing most of the time is the best thing for that land. So just keep that context in mind. But my point is, I got kind of lost. Where was I going originally when I said that? Started this down this.
Complex soils and rotation requiring
Right,
management,
right, right. The
grains
rotation,
on
and so we're
farm.
and we're part of this soil benchmark study, and what it shows is kind of exactly what you would expect from our soils, right? Where the years we have them in hay or pasture, uh, all of the nutrients trend upwards. Um, even on years when we don't, when we're have animals on them after a crop or something, nutrients are trending upwards. Organic matter trends upwards. The only time we've seen things trend downwards is after 2 years of annual grain crop production, and you would expect that. I mean, and that's kind of the point, right? But if you looked at that just as a snapshot, you would say that's bad. You went down. Your numbers went down. You're degrading soil. You're degrading nutrients. All of these kinds of things. But if you look at the whole picture, the whole system, you're going to see a very different picture. Like none of this is like, maybe you can find a linear trend line like you're talking about, but none of this is just always one direction. If it like, that's just not how nature works. That never is how it worked. That was never the way. I mean, there's no such thing as equilibrium, right? It doesn't make sense. Nothing with energy has equilibrium. Like you have to go on either side of that. And agriculture is no different. And so, I mean, it's one of the things that gets me all tied up about carbon credits sometimes. And if you talk to, there's an acquaintance of mine who's a biodynamic farmer in Australia, and we're in pretty hard agreement on this, that there are times when you might want to use the carbon that you sequestered in your soil to grow a crop. Say, like whatever you use for fertilizer, the price goes through the roof, and you have to lean on the positive benefits that you've spent decades like putting into these soils in order to make your operation sustainable, because we can't forget about that, right? Not everyone is a nonprofit that says, Cash App and bio, where it doesn't matter the economics. Like we need to talk about this in real terms, and it is okay to use carbon. It's not okay to use all of it, right? Like you need to be building soil, but there are farming practices that do that extremely well, that get totally left out of the regeneration talk, because we're hyper focusing on these couple of practices as a proxy for an outcome that's just not there. It's just not there. I know some of the stories of the most carbon that's been put into soils are coming from like conventional feedlot operations that also grow row crops, and the balance between the animals and the ground surrounding and supporting those animals is in some sort of balance, right? And I mean, and so we can argue about like animal welfare, and we can argue about like an accumulation of nutrients and all those things, but those are ideological, and the ground that is being farmed, and we can argue about all the inputs that come in and say, is this a good thing, blah 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 blah. But at the end of the day, as far as the farm is concerned, in that context, the soil is regenerating, but the regenerative movement won't even touch those people. They don't want anything to do with it, because it just doesn't look like their version of what regenerative agriculture is supposed to be. And so, I'm not really sure where that leaves us sometimes. And then, you're going to have these conversations in different regions. Like different things work better in different regions. If you're frozen 9 months out of the year or something, that's going to be a very different management strategy than if you're in somewhere where you maybe get one frozen day or something. And so to not include that as part of the conversation around what regenerative agriculture should or shouldn't look like is just crazy to me. And I haven't been too up with Savory recently, but I feel like they do like the like holistic planning approach definitely addresses that. And I find it strange sometimes when people who are part of that community or talk about it a lot, like don't like that. To me is all of it. Like that's so important, that context driven reason for doing things. Like that's really all that matters to me. And we're trying to, or what it appears to be, and I think I maybe know the reason for it. Like there's an operation going on, and the operation is turning regenerative agriculture into a monolith so that it can be monetized, right? but the point of it was never to be monetized. Like that's, and so this is where we just veer off the tracks and we allow these narratives to get built for us. We allow, companies to come in. We allow large farms to use that as their marketing, and maybe they are regenerative, but still, if they're the ones defining it, and it's not everyone who's involved somehow, this is just where we end up. And I don't see any other reason why there'd be so much effort to turn it into a monolith. Like I'm thinking things like cover crops, like you talked about, the annual deal. I'm thinking no-till. I'm thinking grazing, etc. Yeah, I mean those things are just not going to happen in some places, and they're very easily going to be adopted in others. And to just not understand that, to me, means there's something else going on, right? There's definitely a brand of regeneration that's being built, and it's unfortunate.
I like that.
Because
I like that brand.
it's like, yeah.
I have a friend, Precious Puri. She's in Zimbabwe. Indigenous farmer there, I guess you would call her. Brilliant woman, dear friend. And in her culture, which I guess today has been touched by regeneration, but it's still a term that's new. It's kind of like when maybe it's how your parents think about things, or it's how a number of different older organic farmers that I've met in the Northeast have treated it like, oh yeah, that's just organic. It's what we are. Like I didn't think we had an option. Same similar way that she views regeneration, I think. But she told me one time, a year ago maybe, that in her culture, every generation that's born, the elders of her tribe or nation, if you will, they go out and they do ecological monitoring. Now, they don't call it ecological monitoring; they just go out and they observe. And when she was born, they found that they, as a people, had been overhunting the zebra. The wild grazer there, and it had been overhunted, and its population was a little bit lower than the tribal elders believed that it should be. And so they named all of the children born after the zebra. And in their religion, in their culture, they're not allowed to, as an individual, hunt or kill or eat or harvest the animal that they're named after, or the life that they're named after. And so it was a way of associating life and culture with its environment, grounding it with the environment, but also providing that feedback loop, that management and planning process where they were more or less utilizing the culture around them to incorporate their culture into the landscape in positive ways. So that if they had, as a people, had overhunted zebra, they named the next generation after zebras. They can't now hunt zebras. The zebra population increases again. And it's an associative feedback loop, right? And that's the way that their culture has processed for hundreds of years, thousands of years. It's an unknown, in some sense, deep time. The point of that isn't that hunting zebras is a good thing. Although I think this regenerative brand, this monolith that we can monetize, I love that, would like to say it is, right? Hunting this or doing this or really deploying these practices is a negative thing or merely a positive thing. But what's lacking here is the nuance, right? That Precious Puri's culture has lived with for thousands of years. It's lacking the nuance that you're talking about, where, when these areas of your farm are under perennial, management and grazing and pigs and such, they are building soil organic matter. They are increasing in biodiversity. They are, rebalancing in the mineral, macro and micro mineral profiles, etc. And then, yes, we're not carnivores, as much as some people in this modern world would like us to believe. We're not carnivores. We still need grain for, our cars, our diesel engines, whatever they are, the planes that we fly in, all the way to our plates. We still eat, grain products, and we still eat chickens and pigs and such. And so as long as we're not carnivores, we need the combine. And so for a number of, years, like you're saying, you're rotating in, and the landscape might not be as healthy as when it was in a previous state, right? But in the end, like you're saying, the trend is going in a particular direction, which is recurrent health. And in some sense, it's resilience. But what I want to do maybe now, and I want to talk about your exact farming rotation. I think to some people listening, it would be helpful. And if we get to it towards the end of the episode, let's make sure we do. And if we don't, it's okay. But let's put that on the hopper. What I want to in the medium time here, I want to really address, like, if if this thing that regeneration really wants to be, which is resilience at some local level, where food is being produced, habitats are being managed and nurtured and also produced for all of life. Like, before the call, we were talking about how the landscape and the weather has been changing. It's been, freezing cold with snow and everything else. Virginia was 14 degrees for like a week. And now it's 70 up there in Pennsylvania at 60, and all the animals are just suffering, us included. Like we are suffering just like our animals are. Like you said, it'll be much easier if just sat at 20 degrees, constantly. Well, anyways, we are these animals. And so in that same sense, if, and this, I guess this is a question, whether or not you agree or disagree, and maybe you can expand upon it or expound upon it as you see fit. But this lack of nuance to me in this movement, good and bad, it's binary. Grains bad, regeneration is good, but we still rely on grains to regenerate. It seems like this lack of nuance in binary relationship is forcing us into like colonial type individualistic like columns, if that makes sense, where we are regenerative, this land is healing. We don't talk about that over there because it's definitely not. If we're buying grains and, bushels and bushels and bushels and bushels from some unknown location and some unknown state with some unknown practice, and we're just shipping it in, we are like offloading um, the weight that should be contained within community. That is to say, if these grains are going to be produced, if they were produced in our community where the feedback, the return, the reciprocity could all be inhabited, by those local people, it seems like the outcome would be different. But as we off-put or ship out that responsibility out of our purview, that there's something that changes there.
Yeah, and so this is where I can be critical of our current agricultural system, that conventional model, where I think you'd have to figure out what you mean by local, and that's going to mean different things when you're talking about oranges. I mean, that's maybe the whole U.S., or certain products that just aren't grown where we are. And so yeah, you have to come up, and then this is where then it goes off the rails because you're making just abstractions, and it's like us trying to figure it out. But like, let's just say, for example, it's like we can just like portion the US into like 6 regions or something. You know what I mean? And that's what we're talking about. I don't know how many miles that would be, but something like that. And so I do think that sort of regional accountability that comes from a system like that is really important, because it keeps things in check. Because there's no question that there are things that we grow, things that we raise, that are out of balance for the region that they're being grown or raised in. That's just a reality. Down, south of you in the Carolinas, the pork business, they were wildly successful at making pork production incredibly efficient, but they ran out of farmland to use the hog waste on, and it's a real problem. And this is not, just as an aside, this is the place to be critical of a system like that, not the animal welfare necessarily. I mean, people have all their issues, but like for me, the criticism down there is that this is an issue, right? There's not enough land to put the hog manure, from what I understand, and so it piles up. It gets over applied close to barns and things like that. But that's not an unsolvable issue, really, in my mind. Like, that's just planning and management, and maybe moving things around. Like, we humans we're brilliant. Like, we can. This is not an unsolvable problem, but it is a problem. However, the talk, that's not the narrative. No one's talking. I mean, some people are talking about that, but more than likely they're talking about just stop commodity pig farming, right? They're not talking about why or how or anything like that, or like what to replace it with, or anything like that. So, that's an example to me of what you're saying, that if communities had more of that reciprocity, which many farming communities do, the most vibrant farming communities, even within our current system, I mean, I look at what goes on up here where we are in Pennsylvania. I hear stories about, other places in the country where this is the case, where we have a small farm culture, very conventional, but a small farm culture. And so I think that small farm culture is very much a positive, regardless of what you think about the practices. And what crops up around that is industry that supports agriculture. What crops up around that is, food supply chains that support all of the farmers who want to participate in them. And so, it's like, where do you want to draw the line on what's sustainable and not? It's just hard to argue when, I mean, it's hard to argue when people are, buying farms, making money, living good lives, and there is this vibrant farming community. Now you go some places, that was the way it was 60 years ago. It's not anymore. And so the question then becomes why? Like, what happened? The reciprocity that you're talking about is out of balance. You mentioned earlier about, with our rotation, even the land environmentally maybe is going down by the markers that we associate with that. But if we balance the equation and we look at what is going up from the grain that was taken off that land, it's all just has to balance. Like, the equation has to balance. And so we can accept some degradation for some well-being. And then we can lose some well-being to accept some rebuilding or something. And so It's just an equation that has to get balanced. And your discussion about the community is huge. And what people, I feel like, in the regenerative movement often don't understand. I mean, this might not be correct, but it is my feeling that regenerative movements crop up more around urban centers or more densely populated areas, is where a lot of the regenerative
it seems to be.
Yeah, comes from. And they don't have the context of what it is where, I have some acquaintances in South Dakota, and they talk about the reason dairies are moving there right now is because all of these sections of land, I don't even know what a section is. They talk about, it's like 100, I think a quarter, you'd have to look it up. It's a bunch of land, but it's all together. And there's 4 bits with, 2 roads that go through them. And then it's like 100 acres. That is very different from the farming that we're doing. And so to be regenerative in a system like that is naturally gonna look different. Like, things are going to be bigger.
Yeah.
And for the regenerative movement that, I don't say we're part of it anymore, but that I thought that I was part of, big is bad. Big equals bad, and big can equal bad. Like, they're not wrong, but it doesn't always equal bad. It just, and the same thing with small, like, whatever. I don't know. Just back to that. Let's stay on
balance, though.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the monolith building. Let's stay there, and I think balance is a fine subject to keep us centered. I visit for my own health this traditional medical doctor down in Lynchburg, Virginia. She does acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine, herbalism, and things. Trained in Beijing. Just moved here recently with her family, and she's not very capable at the English language. I'll tell you that. Long time ago, my uncle married a lady from Shanghai, I believe. I'm going to have some cousin of mine emailing me later. It's from Beijing or some other problem. But a Chinese woman, her name, Charlie, and he's lived in China since. And about 12 years ago, as many of our listeners know, I came down with a lot of health issues. And acupuncture was one of the first remedies that we sought. But we sought it because him and his wife, Charlie, recommended that I start to see an acupuncturist who was Chinese. Like, don't go to one of those, I'll never forget what he said. He said, don't go to one of those American imposters or something. Like, acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine from a true, Chinese mind, body, soul culture is really what you need. Well, anyways, jump forward 12 years and I'm, still seeing an acupuncturist of Chinese origin and love her to death, but she speaks poor English. And so the small talk, it's always so interesting. Like, every week or every other week when I go in, I'm so eager and I so anticipate the small talk because it's always just so topical and quick, but so infinitely deep. Like, and I bring this up in terms of balance. I'm getting there, I guess. I'm a little bit roundabout to the point, to the punchline. But she said, with her practice. She doesn't want to be poor because then she has problems. And if she makes too much money, then the problems will follow her. But as long as she's balanced right in the middle, where she's neither poor, neither rich, she will be happy, healthy, and true, is what she said.
Mhm.
And then I just walked out of the building and, that was the end of it. Like there was not even a conversation. But it was so interesting to me. Why in this alternative health, this Eastern modality of acupuncture and herbalism and meditation and all of these things that surround it, naturopathy, osteopathy, and all these other things, things that have, come over well to Western medicine in their own ways, they look for balance, right? They don't look for health. Health follows balance. But when I think about Western civilization, when I think about capitalism to some finite degree, it's this push beyond balance. And so if health is balance, and yet this modern social industrialism that capitalism kind of fits within is the lack of balance, it's interesting that regeneration, which according to this conversation, as you so eloquently say, lacks balance in some true sense, also is a monolith for money making, which falls into the Western, industrial complex, not the Eastern modality that health is balance, right? And so this movement and pushing for validity has pushed into a system that we're quite tired of, right? This binary system where growth is good, non-growth is not good. Cheap, fast, quick products are always going to win in the marketplace, and that's a good thing. Like all of these tested, tried, and very tired mythos of our culture are already starting to chew and spit out. But regeneration, to be effective, to be viable in the modern era, still needs to fit within that. And so it's that tension. But then to extend this even further, not only does that tension exist for viability to coexist with it, but then you have farmers, these regenerative farmers getting into the space, right, that truly believe that starting a farm in 2020, 2015, 2024, whenever it began, and buying the land and buying the tractors and buying the UTVs and buying the four-wheelers and buying the hot box chargers and the poly wire and the step-in posts and the livestock trailers and everything else they have to buy, that when they start to actually sell, meat at the local farmers market for 8, 9, 10, whatever dollars a pound, and they're not quote unquote profitable, that now they're angry because they thought that regeneration fit within the capital narrative, this industrial complex that they were born into, and they thought regeneration applied to it. But then they get angry because they realize it doesn't. And so in some sense, what I'm saying is that if regeneration does exist, I'm increasingly of the view and of the opinion that one, it can only exist locally. And what that means is what you're saying, regionalized versions of agriculture, but also regionalized understandings of what it means to regenerate. For instance, it might not mean that this year your landscape increases in a particular scientific metric, but instead increases the production of your neighbor's land so that next year the return of surplus comes back to your land from a community, from a societal, from a whatever perspective. I mean, the perspectives can get quite nuanced, obviously. So one, I'm of that opinion increasingly, that regeneration, what it looks like locally, is going to be different everywhere. But I'm also of the opinion that this 4 or 6 step model that we've been pushed that equals regeneration, keeping the soil covered, never disturbing the soil, those kind of things, living roots in the soil. I'm missing all of them. Obviously, I don't study these things. But those 4 or 6 pillars of regeneration, they don't exist. And the reason they don't exist is because the only way they can exist is if nature is binary, right? A or B, 0 or 1, black or white. And it's just not the case. Even if we want regeneration to exist in that narrative, it is incapable as long as it is true to its original self, just meaning ecological resiliency over time. Let's just say that's regeneration. It can't exist within that narrative because no ecological resiliency over time can exist in a 1 or a 0, an A and a B relationship. It doesn't exist. It can't exist. And so I don't know if you have comments, and you can place a comment after this, but I also want to gravitate, using this maybe as a little transition, over to your interest in growing your own grains for your own animals for sale. Like what have you always done that? Is that a new thought? Like how did you get into not just relying locally? You were talking about regional production of, products that, were in community, and those regions are different depending on where you live in this world and such, bigger, smaller, grander, simpler, whatever that may be. but you're actually existing in your system, growing your own grains for your own pigs and chickens for sale. Like, how did you get there? Why did you get there? Why is that important to the operations of your farm, given the mythos of the last, 50 minutes?
It's just practicality. It wasn't ideology or anything like that. We got into raising hogs because it's very easy thing to do capital wise. Like it's not expensive compared to cattle. We had the money to start raising hogs. That's why we started. We wanted to raise them outside because most pork is raised inside, and it's a very easy product to compete with on taste. Like, it's just not the same thing. Like, people compare them, but even the arguments about like beef sometimes, where it's like, well, is it grass finished, grain finished? Is it from Argentina? Is it from a feedlot in California? Like beef at the grocery store, it's pretty good. I would say pork at the grocery store is just not something I'm terribly interested in. And that's the feedback we got from a lot of people that said, yeah, we stopped eating pork like 10 years ago, and now we eat it again. So that was a very practical business decision. So, and we're making a practical business decision around our pork right now at the same time, but then, and it's literally just based on the product at the end of the day. But so it was mostly my wife. I mean, she knew more about this stuff at all. I was very skeptical of putting pigs outside, but she's persuasive, and we did, and it was successful. And then we grew. We moved the farm. Like, everything scaled up really, really quickly. But I remember, like, my concern, and I guess even though my background is organic, I would say it's much more conventional. Like, it's dairy cows. You bring the feed to the cows. You have these fields. Your time management is like, can you go 7 miles an hour cutting hay, or do you have to go 3 because it's so bumpy? That's a huge difference for a farmer. There's this saying, only a farmer knows the difference between 4 and 4.5 miles per hour. Well, that's a lot of time. And it's a lot of, with everything going on, it's a lot of headache. And so anyway, fast forward to us with these pigs, I'm watching, and, they love it. They're thriving. They're doing wonderfully. But the ground, it's very rooted up. Pigs root. It's part of their nature. The whole point of having them outside is to give them that. I mean, the development in the pork shoulder from that activity is huge. So it's not like we're going to stop them from doing it. But there's a management strategy that has to come here, right? You can't just run. I mean, you can, though. I couldn't just run all these pigs outside and then not have our landscape just tend towards forest, because that's what happens in Pennsylvania. Yeah, like, it's just, there's not really grasslands out here. So the farmland was hacked from the forest. So very quickly, 2 years, we have huge multiflora rows. We have cedars in the pastures, things like that. So the management on like a perennial hog pasture would have looked like we would have mowed it, had to mow it. To mow it, we would be driving on it. And that was a nightmare. We're talking like 2 miles per hour across this thing. And so it just makes absolute sense to include, and not only that, you have manure deposits, and you have tons of biomass. From the way we started was on old crop ground. We planted annual crops, like high biomass ones, and we just turned the pigs out using electric fence. We could move them wherever we needed to move them. We used to move them very kind of quickly. We stopped doing that. We give them big blocks now, like a couple acres, and then we move them a couple acres, something like that. So that's a change, and that's just something, we learned and worked better for us. But the kicker here was, before we were growing grains, we were turning those fields over with a disc and then planting new cover crops. And so it was like very intense. Like I was saying, pigs are intense. This land is dynamic. Annual crops are intense, and it was a pretty good rotation, and it worked pretty well. And we were constantly mixing up their manure, the biomass, and with tillage now, which is not regenerative, I guess. But and like, parasites, all of those kinds of things, like getting mixed into the soil just was better. for the system. But it all stemmed from that practical reason that, you see like 30 hogs out on a couple acres, and you immediately know this is going to have to be, like, something's going to have to happen here if we're going to use the traditional methods of agriculture, which we now use. And again, someone could argue, well, you shouldn't be doing that, and maybe you should just stick pigs in the forest, or maybe you should put them here. But that's not what we did. We used them to turn over, organic material, to whatever the soil tests are telling us is helping build, soil. So it's not that it's wrong. It's just part of what we did. And so that decision was a purely practical one. And so then enter the grains. Now you take, a full field, you just move all the infrastructure off the field, pigs, fencing, all of it, which we use just 2 strands of electric, like high tensile electric wire. We wrap it all up, pull the posts out, move them. And you come through and do full tillage and plant a crop that is going to thrive on all of that biomass that they have like beat down, and all of their manure, all of the minerals from the feed that we had out there. And so it's just a regionally appropriate and species appropriate management tool. And pigs eat grain. So there's that part. Now we do sell into commodity markets as well. Like, so that was a management strategy, that was partially to pay for the equipment needed to continue doing what we were doing at the scale we did. But, it was purely practical. And I can get into ideological stuff. Like I have a way I like to farm for all kinds of reasons. But I would be lying if I said that was the main reason to do it. And so it's just secondary. It always is going to take second fiddle to like just looking and observing and seeing what's happening, and then creating the balance that you're talking about with that system. And I think there are a lot of systems that do that really well, that get looked over by the regenerative folks pretty hard, and for whatever reason.
Well, there's a natural limit there, and I'm sure you see it and you feel it. Maybe now with the excess, that you can produce, it feels less stressful, or it feels less present, because now you sell into a little bit of the commodities market. But like I think one of the critiques that we've had with regeneration for so long is there's no upper limit. Like every healthy natural system, one of its definitions is limits. Right? How fast can a bird fly? How fast can a cow breed? Right? There's a particular limit there that no matter how hard the bird or the cow or whatever other, tree, grass, soil, nematode, whatever, it can't supersede that limit. And so it has to live within its own pace, within its own time. There's a limit there, and that limit seems to be very helpful and healthy and balancing in natural systems. Agriculture has a tendency to lift that limit, right? So, I always say in the 1920s, we commodified corn, and we try to grow as much corn per acre, or per bushel per acre, whatever, as possible, for the feeding of the world, and the feeding of diesel engines, and for the feeding of animals and other things, of course. And in the 2020s, there's not really different. It's just not corn, it's carbon, right? We've taken that industrial mindset, we applied it to the carbon system, and now we're just trying to sequester as much carbon as fast as possible, and we forget the nuance. None of these things are intrinsically negative. But when we start to manage a local place, one thing that I find very, very helpful as that local place is trying to build resilience while being harvestable. Because that's the thing we don't often talk about. Like, resilience is fine, but unharvestable resilience is, to some degree, not the point, right? The grass grows to feed herbivores. If the grass grew but it couldn't feed an herbivore, would it continue to grow? Right? We don't have to look at it from a human perspective. This truth is truth regardless of humanity, civilization, or not. But a limit is very helpful. And so to some degree, you can only feed your chickens and your pigs the grain if you are producing it as you can produce it. So for instance, if those chickens and pigs were to reduce the ecological viability of the landscape and your grain production drop, your chicken and pig production would have to drop, right? And so there are feedback loops and mechanisms, and a system contained in place isn't just an ideological, check mark, to some philosophical conversation. It actually is an ecological standard that nature inhabits within, where resilience can actually play and be birthed. And so, you have the idea of limits, within that balance, I think.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, that is the key. And I think that as the U.S. agriculture has always been, from my understanding, built on the idea of export. Um, from the very early tobacco plantations, et cetera. So it's been built on this idea of surplus, and we have continued, from what I can tell, to implement uh, policies that support that. And so what happens is, what I see, and where I am critical of our current agricultural system, the whole way down the line, is that we stack incentives for things that are just man-made and like clearly contrived. Whether that's crop subsidies, whether that's crop insurance, even the cover crop programs, right? There's federal dollars that you can get as a producer to pay for cover crops, and that does something, and it changes how the industry looks. It changes how people think about it. Public money. I'm not against using public money to drive outcomes, but I am against pretending like we know what we're doing with that. Like, that's a very powerful tool, and we don't always know what the outcomes are going to be, or the side effects, and we just have to look at it for what it is, and realize that um, there are things that are out of balance, and we have to understand that the people who are using, let's say, corn, for example, in this country to trade with other countries for oil, have a different goal for agriculture than someone who is growing corn, perhaps, right?
Mm.
And it's not some tinfoil hat like they're trying to get us. It's just literally how it is, and it's literally um, just not everyone has the same goal, and we shouldn't pretend like we do. But what comes from that system, especially with public money, and why I'm critical of it, is it gets in the way of this balance. It gets in the way of, like, what we've seen is that the number of crops we grow has been reduced. And we have consolidated not only farms, but we've consolidated crops. And it's hard to know whether or not that was just a natural tendency that would happen for an area, just because certain things become more competitive, and so then they become more competitive. That's kind of how capitalism works in its purest sense anyway. As soon as something gets a foothold, it can easily run away with the industry. But I don't know if that's what's causing it, or if what's causing it is the incentives that are out there to make agriculture look a certain way. And if we're sitting here talking about how, like, regional balance is super important, those two things to me are antithetical, because the only way you figure out what that regional balance actually looks like is a pure or relatively pure market driven kind of model. And the reason I say market driven is just, it's just individuals making decisions based on the things right in front of them. And so you have all of those individuals' brains working together to figure out what that, regional community or regional industry is going to look like, not some overlord wizard, like, top down, pumping it into, pumping what they desire into that industry, which just, confuses what it's actually supposed to look like. So yeah, I don't know, and I don't really know what you do about that, but it's definitely something that has to be kept in mind. I think, especially for
Yeah.
if we're saying that balance is the goal, and yeah, I don't know what else to say about that, but that's a huge thing that we're up against that's often not spoken about.
Yeah. Well, I think without balance and without in sight honed on limits, we have this heroic narrative. And I think the subsidies and the federal programs and the grants and everything else just add to that heroic narrative. meaning that, we'll pay you to be the hero of the climate crisis. We'll pay you to create products that are, climate smart commodities. We'll pay you to do things that we've deemed, ecologically resilient, but not locally adapted, for instance, right? It's that hero narrative that to some degree, like I mentioned earlier in the episode, Haddon Turner, a previous guest on Denusion, when he said, I want to be a celebrity within 15 miles, that hero narrative contrasts with that. He used the word celebrity, but like, I want to be a hero in the local place. And as we extend beyond the local place and we try to be a hero on social media and we say, look at our farm, it's amazing. Look at the soil that we're building and we're growing all of this grass, when in reality, we planted it all, or in reality, we imported it all. Or look at our pigs, they're fat and happy, but don't look at the grain fields where those pigs' grains have been grown 5 states in the other direction, or even 1 state in the other direction. It's that it allows that hero narrative to rule and reign, which I think just destroys everything that is near and dear to the actual heart of regeneration. Like if it were to be a real thing, animate in its own way, and it were to have a heart, I don't think being a hero of the modern day or the ancient day has anything to do with it. It's just life in its way. Like, like when a cow's out there grazing, when a pig is out there foraging, when a grain seed is out there sprouting, I don't think they're thinking to themselves like, man, look at me. Like, look at what I'm doing for the climate. Like, they're just being a cow, right? They're just being a pig. They're just being a seed of grain, trying to do its best in its own way with self-understanding in its own sense. And it seems like humanity in regenerative, the modern regenerative movement, is trying to be the opposite. We're trying to be this hero where, we shine lights on the virtuous particulars, and we try to, put in the darkness and the dimness outside of social media all the ugliness. We don't talk about, the inabilities of some of these markets to actually produce profit and livelihood. We don't talk about the volunteers and apprentices that work full time for nothing at all. We don't talk about the cost of seed stock or breeding stock, especially in like cattle operations or even goats and sheep. Like, it is unbelievable, if I can put a pin in that right quick. When my wife and I got into farming maybe a decade ago, like, you could buy a goat for nothing. Like, you could easily acquire a herd of goats or sheep for not much money at all. Like, you really, like, weekend holiday retreat would, build you a herd of 10 goats. Like, that money was exchangeable. Oh my gosh, they are so expensive today. The number, and I think it's just because the number of people getting into hobby farming who will pay whatever for 1 or 2 backyard sheep or goats is unprecedented in terms of the supply in the marketplace. Like, you could buy a goat for $100, whatever it was, and now they're like $600, $700, $800. Like, I could buy a cow for $800, or I can buy this little 50-pound goat, or I can buy a 2,000-pound. Like, it's absolutely insane what is happening today. And we don't talk about these things. Rather, we talk about, look at my soil test, look how regenerative I am because I want to be, look at my grass, look at me, look how beautiful my landscape is. And, it's beautiful because I own it and I can control where it's going and the resilience is mine. Like, that's the narrative, right? It's not a narrative of humility, of balance, of limits, of, local communities working together where, like, when you go over to your neighbor's house, you're not putting it on social media. It's not social media-able, as if that's a verb in any way. It's an entirely different reality. But we're just like imbued with, we've been trained to believe that this regeneration has to be marketable, right? Because we believe that it also fits within this idea of mother culture and industrial capitalism and everything else. When in all reality, yes, while we can't cancel those systems, we can't reduce them down to something that doesn't matter, property tax, liability insurance, gas, health, whatever you're using the money for. New shoes, my God, that would be nice. You still have to be subservient to that system. We can't be aliens in this world. But that doesn't mean that our management and balance over rotations in an agricultural environment, which is also a natural environment, that has to be overly mechanistic. Like you're saying, it doesn't have to be a monolith money making. It can make money, maybe, but it doesn't have to be a monolith. It seems like there's a different position there that you're approaching. You're not looking at tillage, grains, etc., from a reductionist top-down perspective, where you see the lack of tillage as a monolith to progressivism and the absence of that as the destroyer of the world as we know it, but rather you see the nuance, the complexity, And thereby, it's as it sounds to me, your system has limits. Your system is progressing towards a balance, and there's health there. More health than simply looking at your neighbor, going back to the beginning of this conversation and saying, man, look at the decades of historical abuse over this land. Now look at my land. It's not being abused. But I keep interrupting my own self, and then I'm going to be quiet and let you address some of these thoughts. But I said this recently to somebody who's a naturopathic doctor, and it seemed like it clicked, although I haven't seen much of a change in their lifestyle yet, but it seemed like it clicked mentally. If somebody were to go into that naturopathic doctor's office and they say, listen, I got some severe cavity pain, something here in my abdomen just isn't right, whatever it is, and the naturopath is looking at it and they're feeling on your stomach or whatever, maybe they're a chiropractic naturopath, whatever they are, but they're looking at it and they're like, man, your liver is shit. I mean, it is straight shit. I can't believe you're alive. But your heart's good. Here's a clean bill of health and you can go. That would never occur, right? You would immediately fire that naturopath, chiropractor, doctor, whoever they were. Because if your liver is no good, your heart can't be good. Even if it's good for the moment, it's not going to be good for all moments. And your body is going to be collapsing very soon. But if you were to stand on your farm, look at your neighbor's farm, right, and say that's degenerative, but I'm regenerative, that also doesn't make much sense unless we live in an isolationist, vertically, I was going to say vertically integrated, but that's not even the case really anymore. Like that would be even better, but just vertical column of individualism where my farm is good because it's my farm. But the same air flows from mine to yours and yours to mine, the same water from yours to mine, mine to yours, the same roots, the birds, the bees, all of the pollen that jumps back and forth, the weed seeds, my weed seeds, like it's all connected, right? That's the liver, I'm the heart. And although the heart appears well, if my neighbor is the liver and it is dying, our earth is going to die, period, right? We all live in the same womb of soil. And so to me, what I'm hearing from you is this nuance that while practices do matter in management, that is where their matters stop. That the balance and limits and complexities of place, are more open than regeneration as a term might allow.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. I've always said that. I mean, you have to talk about the practices. I'm not saying you don't. Those are the details. And that's where most of the talk gets stuck. I just don't feel like it flows outside of that. I mean, you go to these. I used to go to conferences. I don't go anymore. My wife goes. I just can't. I just lose my mind. I'm like ready to yell at people. She's like, I'm like, you stay home with the kids. She goes with a friend. Because of that reason right there, the things that are actually important for the movement aren't being discussed, and so that's why then I have questions about, or I just don't believe that what that movement says they want and what they actually want are the same thing, and so that's what it comes down to. I mean, I would say for me, you mentioned a little while back, and I can't quite come up with it here, but my concern, and the only reason I've started to be vocal about this in the past 2 years, is that I just don't believe the reasons people say they're doing things are the actual reasons. Like, I just don't believe them, So,
Yeah.
and this is like across the board. This is not just for regenerative people, and maybe I'll just get chastised by everyone. When an organic farmer says, I'm an organic farmer because chemicals are killing the world, I'm like, well, we can talk about that, but I don't believe you. I don't believe that's the reason. When a soybean producer, conventional soybean producer says, well, I plant GMO soybeans so I can feed the world. I'm like, nah, don't believe you. There's plenty of good reasons to do what you're doing, and I want to hear those reasons. It's not about feeding the world. First of all, you're not feeding the world. Also, what the hell does that even mean? It's just a silly narrative. And the same thing with the organic folks who are talking about chemicals. It's like, wait, why do you, like, I just don't understand. It's like, it's not, like, I'm not saying that it's not part of the conversation or it's not an important part of the conversation, but I want to know why people are doing things for real. And one of the best One of the best stories that I've heard on that topic are from Elliot Coleman, and I'm going to paraphrase, but basically it's about when he started farming. And he said, well, it was a neighbor or an acquaintance or something that sold them some land very cheaply up in Maine. And he said, we were going to farm it organically because, you know, they were farming it organically and it just made sense. But really it was all about the adventure. It was like, this was going to be an adventure. We're going to take this piece of land and turn it into a farm. Right. And then he'll just talk about it and you can see him light up when he's talking about it. And it's like, yeah, that's what we want to see. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, yeah, okay, it was organic and all this stuff, but they've never been certified organic. Right. So he's just doing farming practices that clearly work. Like, this was in the 60s, maybe, and they are still there, second generation on the farm, clearly a working system. And yeah, it just comes back to the reasons why people do things. And I think we should focus on those. Like, I would want to know, like, if I could ask Gabe Brown or Will Harris or any of them, like, why, and I've heard it kind of in some of their talks, but it's never just an explicit question. Like, why do you farm the way you farm? And when what I've heard from Gabe Brown on that topic is very much that he, like, wasn't making money. They were struggling. They almost lost the farm, right? That's a real story. That's a story about someone who is not trying to save the world. They're trying to save their farm. And Will Harris has the same story, essentially. And so how do we then go from that? Like, that's okay for them. But someone who, you know, has a conventional feedlot in Nebraska, who, you know, maybe finished a couple hundred head of cattle and grew some conventional grains for them and all this kind of stuff, decided, well, hey, in the new era with the next generation, we need to raise that. So we're bringing in more cattle or something, and we're going to import some grain, you know, to quite literally save the farm. Like, that's not okay. Right. And again, it's totally reasonable to talk about practices. It's totally reasonable to talk about what we want American agriculture to look like and all of these kinds of things. But we're like missing the forest for the trees, to use a cliche there, you know, where it's like, these are real stories of people, like, doing things to produce food and get what would hopefully be positive ecological results as well in their communities. Why are we demonizing that? I mean, there's plenty of things to demonize, and like, there's also stories, right? It's just hard because there's the nuance here is that there isn't a monolith. Like, there's bad regenerative farmers, there's bad conventional farmers, there's good conventional farmers, there's good regenerative farmers, and so you can't, like it, whatever we're talking about, it has to be more than just the simple little nugget that some sort of marketing operation is trying to sell you on both sides.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I
sides.
couldn't. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I mentioned to you this in a previous conversation, but I'll mention it here. You see this from all sides, and you see it a lot from a marketing position. Because what's the difference between, like you were saying, the conventional farmer with the feedlot and grain production trying to save their farm by, you know, doing more grain production or something, and the difference between that and White Oak Pastures, Gabe Brown, saving their farms through different ways. It's to me, the difference is that hero marketing effort, right? Like Gabe and Will and others, you can just keep going with these names. Like, their operation is saving the world. Right. And so they're saving their farm is also them saving the world. And now the world has to care. And it's a marketing push. And I'm not saying it's untrue. I'm not saying that better agriculture isn't going to aid in decreasing the pace in which the climate warms. Right. Scientifically, it seems like that's probably the case. So there is a little bit of heroism going on. But the heroism is celebrated not because of its innate virtue, but because of its marketability. And I think that is a huge difference. And I think the same thing is true for a lot of these brands, consumer packaged goods, CPG companies, which probably the people of this podcast that listen faithfully have so gotten bored of listening to me because we've been talking about it for years. But like, for instance, I'll give you this, and I won't mention any names, but those who know will know, and those who don't just, they won't know. But the example is still pure and true. I was asked to keynote a conference down in Texas this past spring at this organization that also runs a CPG company. And, the company is known to be like the leader in the regenerative grazing movement, purveying online, ship to your door, the best regenerative meats on the planet. And they're communal, the community focused, like their entire conference was literally like, the conference was titled something like the regenerative power of community or something. I mean, they're all about community. They're all about regeneration. They're all about local, people and farmers and things working together and connection between humanity and their place. And that's their mythos. I should rephrase, that's their marketing. And, I happen to know a lot about this organization. I can tell you that when you, living in Pennsylvania, were to go online and buy their meat comes from California or Montana, unless it's deer or wild game, then it comes from New Zealand, which is way too easy of an example, so I'll leave that there. But it goes from California or Montana to Texas. It's processed, it's moved, it travels thousands of miles, and then it gets in, a FedEx 2-day air package or plane, and it flies in the air to Pennsylvania. And it's absolutely no different in its conventional nature besides one thing, right? And that's the land in which that animal originally, thousands upon thousands upon thousands and dozens of hands prior to your hands touching the package, was raised on maybe regenerating pastures, at least grass occupying pastures, right? And so, yes, while that system is being constructed to give large producers that are conventionally minded, conventional outlets, while being able to allow them to still market the regeneration of their landscapes. And while that narrative does help imbue this heroic narrative of regenerative agriculture solving the climate crisis as if the climate crisis is a crisis and not an opportunity to come back into relationship with the earth, but rather a crisis for science to solve. I mean, we can get very deep there. While those things are true, this narrative is really just a narrative of heroism to be marketed. Because the same people who are running this organization have currently, previously, I should say, built 2 other organizations to exit, right? So they sold them to General Mills and other places to exit. And I'm not saying they're going to do it again, but the point is that's their track record, right? It's a very beautiful organization doing beautiful things in the conventional way. And I have no problem with this. If people in Pennsylvania need to eat California grown produce that is raised regeneratively because they have no other option and they can do it online and it's convenient and accessible, maybe it's eradicating food deserts, I don't know. That's not a bad problem. That's not an issue. The problem is that it is marketed as the solution to a problem that it has nothing to do with. Nothing to do with. When we're talking about regeneration and resilience, we can't be transporting meat 3, 4, 5,000 miles from its source, right? So that the nutrients that animal procures from its environment, which the health industry calls nutrient density, nutrient-rich soils produce nutrient-dense beef. If that beef is nutrient dense because it is grown on nutrient-rich pastures, that nutrient density is a gift from the nutrient-rich pasture. That is to say that the nutrients occupied the pasture, it went into the cow took it as a gift, and then you flew the cow all the way across the country. That cow was consumed, and that manure, although it's human manure, then goes into a local distribution system, a waste distribution and treatment facility, where those nutrients never get deposited back into the California pastures. Right? This is why Vandana Shiva says that any system that exports its food is a nutritionally devoid landscape, is linearly true. It's mathematically true. If we continue to export the nutrients, we're going to have to bring in more nutrients to replenish them. Period. End of story. And over time, this regeneratively marketable, heroic organization and story will be depleting the California landscape. It's inevitable. Right? That's why, in the large scheme of things, resilience has to be regional. It has to be, not in any sort of legal perspective, right? Like, let things go, right? Give gifts, let it transport all around. But if the system is dependent upon exports, that's the difference. It's not that we don't allow exports to happen. It's rather that the system is dependent on those exports. That system cannot be regenerative in time. Momentarily, it's marketable, but over the scheme of time, it will have to collapse. In the same way that conventional agriculture has to rely on, I mean, everything from pesticides to fertilizers in order to keep their systems growing. Conventional in the sense that it's large-scale monocrops, filled with, GMOs and true tillage and repeated, mismanagement, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I tend to agree with you on the regional part for sure. I don't know what that looks like on every crop, and I like how you put, it's really the dependence that matters more than um, it's just being a hard and fast rule. I mean, I think it's interesting when you look at the
Yeah.
most successful regenerative brands and how they um, distribute their product in terms of that. It's much less local than most other food sheds, I would say. Honestly, I mean, I don't know the extent of that dynamic necessarily. I mean, California produces most of our produce in this country, I believe. Right, that's a huge export market, and like I said before, American agriculture, to my knowledge, has always been built on the idea of exports, like ever since the first tobacco plantations or whatever the first thing here was. And so we have that to contend with. I mean, we have lots to contend with on that conversation because we have disproportionate population centers and the way local planning happens around farmland. I mean, up here where I am, it was all farms. It's not all farms now, and so that is something that we have to figure out what that's going to look like. There's a lot of food produced in Pennsylvania locally, but there's places where there's no food produced, just period.
Right.
And so that is
like a sense of it's like a just to interrupt you. I think it's this lacking sense of holism, which I think holistic management, holistic plan grazing from a management or planning perspective does well. I think we just generally as a people lack this, and I think it's because we're ungrounded. I think there's a lot of reasons, but we were recently approached just because we know a lot what's happening in the Mid-Atlantic due to our work and influence, if you will, by an organization that's trying to create a liver shelf-stable beef jerky type thing, snack of some kind, which I applaud. Sounds great. See if it works. But they were looking for 5,000 pounds of liver every other week, I think. I'm gonna have to fact check that on me. It was either every week or every other week, 5,000 pounds of liver. And 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 what a lot of people don't immediately understand from that, because a lot of people in the space are quite excited. Wow, 5,000, let's say 5,000 pounds of liver, every other week, so 2,500 pounds a week. What an opportunity, right? Like, just what a unbelievable opportunity for farmers to be able to use their offal, that which some farmers can't sell and some farmers can't keep in stock, to make some added, money for their farm business and such. But what I told the company was this: 2,500 pounds of liver a week. I mean, generally speaking, we've raised cows for 10 years. I don't think I've ever got more than 8, 10, 12 pounds of liver per cow at the most. Like if it was a huge, truly, well-sized cow. So let's say 10 pounds, right? So that's 250 cows a week that you want to harvest just for the livers. Now, listen, there are 250 cows a week somewhere in the United States being harvested every single week that could provide this. But the point is, those systems are conventional systems, conventional in the way that it's production first, right? If there's an organization where there's 150 localized human scale farms that are producing at a good local regional perspective and commodity size, that are able to aggregate in that sort of way to fit 250 cows a week into a production line where we can actually keep up with your liver demand, that's fine. It doesn't exist. I know that for a fact. Been around that boat for 5 years. It's never going to exist. But what you're looking for is a conventional product with the word grass-fed and finished and regenerative slapped on it. That's the difference. There's no way for you to access that commodity market, 250 cows a week of just livers. Like, we don't need the hearts, we don't need the organs, we don't need the suet, the caul fat, whatever it is. We don't need the meat, we don't need the brains, we don't need the hoofs, the bones, whatever. I just want the livers, right? It's that reductionist perspective where while we want to be able to market that it's, you know, the hero of the world, grass-fed and finished, local regenerative food, regenerative liver, chemical free for your pleasurable hiking needs, whatever it's being marketed as, that doesn't work in a holistic system, right? And so like what we have to do is separate our desire for heroism, our desire to offer a product to our community that they really, really want, from our ability and the land's ability to actually produce that at its own balance and at its own limits. No one farmer could produce 250 cows a week, every week, 52 weeks out of the year at a commercial production system and still be a local human scale regenerative farmer. It's not possible. I mean, White Oak Pastures is the biggest regenerative farm that I know of on the East Coast, and they can only produce 4 or 5 cows a day at the most. The biggest. And there's even problems, with their system. But 4 or 5 cows a day, let's say 5 times 5 is 25, right? They can barely meet even 1/10 of that liver volume as the biggest regenerative farm that has its own problems with scale and size. And anyway, so my point is we have to allow, if the biggest among us couldn't come in 1/10 of what you need per week, and yet you want us to be a part of it, it's not physically possible. We have to separate what we want from this heroic marketing story where it's just commercial capitalism writ in a different narrative, or commercial farming writ in a different regenerative narrative with a different regenerative label slapped on it, from the actual world of actual things, which has limits, which requires balance, which also requires nuance, getting back to grains and so many other things that we've talked about. This nuance has to reign. And I was reading on your site, and correct me if this is wrong, but as your white website says, you have 2 herds of cattle. One is Hereford, grass-fed and finished. One is the bottle calves that you finish out. But to do it well and humanely, you utilize grain in that secondary process. That's nuance, and to me, that's exciting, right? Instead of letting these calves just die because they didn't have the nourishment they need, and their body genetically and epigenetically need that added nourishment or nutrients in order to live, right? You supplied it to them, but you don't let that system extend just for convenience sake. Right? There's actual decisions being made in the actual world of things, where actual decisions are being weighed and measured into, like, what is the community? What do I have? What resources do we have to develop? What relationships can we lean on? And how can we pull this together to find balance? That's exciting.
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
whole heroic marketing endeavor to me is just, laughable.
Well, and that's absolutely the case. And that's why we're even talking about, I don't know, we haven't updated that website probably in more than 2 years, possibly. But just getting away from all that marketing in general. Like, first and foremost, our customers don't, it's not that they don't care, but they care about us, not necessarily that the beef is grass-fed or not grass-fed. And they, the proof is in the pudding, the product that they're receiving. And the reason we made those decisions was not because of ideology. It was because it's easier for us to raise this group of Herefords and just let them graze. Like, we don't do anything fancy with them. Like, we're blessed to have the space to do that for them, where they just really don't need much management. But they, we're finishing steer that hang at 800 pounds in 19 months on only grass. So that's a great system for us. I mean, I'm not going to complain about it, especially when you balance the inputs and the management and all those sorts of things. The bottle calves, there's just no way without grain to do that. And so then the alternative is, I don't know what the alternative is. They would just go to the auction, those bull calves from the dairy, because those dairy cows have a calf every year.
Right.
And if there's, my parents milk 120, I think, 100 maybe.
Wow.
Or I don't know how many calves they're having a year, is my point. They're milking like 80 to 100 is what the barn can hold. But the point is, those cows are all having calves. So half of them statistically are bull calves. So what are we going to do? And I'm willing to do the work. And so here we go. But we need grain to finish those and create a good product and a good life for them. But the point is, the decision wasn't made because of ideology. It was made based on just practical community-based stuff. And the customers want to buy it, and they just don't care that, they're buying our beef. because they trust us, and that's the relationship you're talking about. And to touch on your point about this liver example, I think a lot of so to me that is agribusiness, right? So there's like two levels. There's agricultural producers, and then there's agribusiness. And we probably should touch on that to like kind of ground some of my criticism on not so much criticism, but to ground where I think solutions actually lie. Where producers, I don't think, have the control that the narrative would like to sort of put on them. Like
Yeah,
that you
this is
can
good.
just decide to go and direct. This whole thing about like, well, buy directly from a rancher. It's like, well, yeah, sure, definitely do that. But to think that the amount of food that is produced in this country is going to be direct marketed, like all of it, is just patently insane. Like that's never going to happen. Right. I mean, I think I saw even organic as the largest sort of alternative movement. Now they're actually left out of alternative now, which for whatever reason. But when you look up the numbers, I think it's like 7% market share of food sales. Anything that's more alternative than organic is less than 1%. And that would probably include direct marketing stuff, although the statistics might not even know that. So who knows? But it's so small, they don't care. Like say it's 1%, like whatever. But the problem is not so much that producers don't want to do these things. Like we're beholden to a system which for what it was designed to do is not inherently bad. And so if we want a different outcome, we need to look to the agribusiness side of what that is. And every time I've been engaged with like an alternative agribusiness model, and that alternative model doesn't necessarily look that much different from a conventional model. I'm just going to like put that out there. But the outcomes are different, and they're different. And I can't always explain why. Like maybe the mindset going into them was that we just want to pay more, or maybe we don't have to market, because this was the early success of the organic industry was they had no marketing budget because they didn't need it, because the story of those farmers was the marketing. And so their gross margin was wait, I'm going to get this wrong. They basically had more money within their margin because they had no marketing budget. You know what I mean? Whereas like a big brand is going to have a large, they got to get on TV, buy Dannon yogurt, buy this, buy that. And the organic industry never had to do that. And so part of the success of organic producers was due to the organic agribusiness that cropped up. And that success was just more food dollars going back to the farmer. And so I think it's a great example. Like, I don't want to sound like a shill for the organic industry. I'm not. I just think it's a good example of when you look at where the successes were and you look at where the failures were, because it's probably the longest going alternative commercially viable movement in this country, or maybe the world. And you look at that, there's a lot to learn from those things. Like, and one of the biggest takeaways for me is that if the agribusiness that surrounds individual producers has different outcomes in mind, or builds into its model the opportunity for those outcomes by either canceling out certain things or whatever it is, like just finding some efficiencies, it doesn't take long to change what happens at the farm level. But to think that every producer is going to go out there and somehow change the world, like you're saying, this heroic narrative is just absurd. And I think what's sorely lacking is the conversation around, the business models that support what people would like agriculture to look like. And I think that's where some of the big spokespeople for the industry fall short, because the answer is just, well, we'll just do meat procurement. You just ship it to you or something. And like Will Harris and them guys down at White Oak, they buy a locker or something, and then they control their production, and here you go. And that's great, and it works for them. But that's not a large scale. That's not really a scalable or even replicable, which is what they like to say instead of scale. But it's not even a replicable situation. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll address that in a second. I have to I have to provide you the story. You're gonna die with your parents and family background being in dairy. We had this lady with us. Doesn't matter who she is. Doesn't even matter. She's a lady. She's a person with us who was an idealist, a philosophical idealist, and who loved raw milk. I mean, like she truly believed in the nutrition of raw milk beyond, God. I mean, it was a little bit far for me. And we were at this dairy doing some consulting, basically ecological monitoring and consulting, and they took us to the calf barn, and because you had to feed the calves milk and such, and there was some grain out or whatever else, and the lady who was relatively new to the space, I'll give her that, she just couldn't believe it. She lost her brain. She was like, why are these calves separated from their families? Why are they eating grain? Why are they suckling on these gallon bottles with nipples, red nipples, rubber nipples at the bottom? She couldn't believe it. She truly lost her mind, and she had a glass of raw milk in her hand because we had just left the dairy, and they gave her a taste test, the dairy barn where they just got done milking. She had a taste test of warm raw milk, and she just was losing her mind. Like, I couldn't figure out why these calves were the way they were. And the farmer, I'll never forget it. It was like 4:30 in the morning, 4:45, because we'd been milking early. He had a day job because he wasn't making enough money as a plumber. And he looked at her and he goes, "'Cause you're drinking their milk." Like that, like, do you not get it? Like you're you're the reason they're here. Like if you weren't drinking this milk, they would be. But because you need it or want it, right? That like there's a whole layer here, is my point, of mandatory agricultural systems. I can't call it anything else. They're mandatory agricultural systems that must inhabit the process if you, the consumer, are going to continue to live your consumption type lifestyle. Like if you want milk and you don't want bottle babies, go buy your own cow, let it nurse half the time and you milk it half the time, and let it do it in your backyard and you do it twice a day or once a day, right? Like that's the only alternative, in my understanding of the case, to a bottle baby. In the same sense, I will never forget it. Talking to a friend of mine who produces grains, he said, Daniel, if you have problem with the combine, the grain combine, you have to become a carnivore and stop. And it's a nice little tagline. If you have a problem with combine, you have to be a carnivore. But the meaning of that statement is so deep to me. Like in the same sense as bottle babies and your backyard milk cow, if you are consuming grains, you either have to produce those grains by yourself in whatever way that you see fit, which is going to be 0.001% of the global population, as you understand, or some, approximation of that value, or you have to be okay with combines. And the combine driver, that is Jeremy of Pasture Song Farm, like you have to trust that he is, or they, him and his wife and family and volunteers, employees, whoever they are, working that system, making those decisions, the life that inhabits that place, are making the best decision they possibly can for their life, for the land's life, and for their consumer's life. And as long as that is a local, regional process where all of those questions can be asked, I don't care if it's regenerative or not, because it's generative, right? It's resilient. It's building in its resiliency. Generative, not necessarily regenerative as the monolith to money making, but generative. It is creating life. It is sustaining life. And anyways, I just wanted to provide that. It was so funny just looking at her face. Like, I don't know if she's ever going to drink milk again. Like, it was brilliant. It was awesome. But no, I think I think you're completely right. Go ahead, please.
Oh, sorry. There's a little lag. No, I was just going to say, I tend to err on the side of wanting, like, that word generative is much better than regenerative, and I think that's what was actually meant by the movement. But the problem is it's been co-opted, definitely. Being generative in your community, on your farm, creating the things that you need, not necessarily all of them, is one of the most subversive things you can do to our system, because you're not buying that thing then, right? Yeah, you're not buying it. Whether it's you're generating fertilizer from your animals, or whether you're generating soil health from whatever cropping system you're doing. When you get away, I mean, there's any kind of example, like we can generate things, and that's the only reason that you can talk about agriculture anyway in the first place of being a sustainable project, is that we have sunlight that is a huge input into agriculture, and water, I guess. I mean, but we are exporting stuff, whether into our bodies or to sell to for other people to put into their bodies, like you were saying earlier. And the more you can fine tune whatever system you're using to generate what it needs from the things that are free, like sunlight and water and whatever inherent mineral is in the soil. I mean, there's schools of thought that say we don't really even need to apply some of the micronutrients. We do, if the soil is healthy enough, it kind of can etch those minerals out. This is an aside,
Right.
but there is an argument for tillage of green manures for that very reason, because when green manures are lightly tilled into soil, they release, I believe, carbonic acid, which will etch minerals out of stone. And if you have a true no-till system, you actually don't get that, and you get like very stratified nutrient profiles, which may or may not be okay. It's going to depend on your crop and things like that. Again, back to your context. But if you're growing just hugely productive, high biomass crops over and over and over again without that sort of like dynamic environment, you can run into trouble. And I think some of the Corn Belt is seeing that at the moment, where that gets pushed. But yeah, my point is just being able to generate whatever it is, A, that you can generate, and B, not have to buy, is one of the most subversive things you can do on an operation. And that is something that our economic and political system is just not down with. They've never been down with
Yeah.
that. And I don't think that's controversial, really, to say that. I don't blame them for not. I mean, people are trying to make money. Like, whatever, that's how our system works. The government is trying to it has its agenda when it comes to agricultural policy and things like that, and we just have to know what those things are, so then we can make decisions and the way we talk about things. And so if the goal of, well, I'll leave it there. Yeah, I'm gonna get too far off into the weeds
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. Silence is sometimes the rage against the machine. Like when we pause, that is rebellion. When we don't need your products, we are in some sense rebelling against the system. I think that's brilliant. Jeremy, I think we could possibly talk all day. And I've said that occasionally in these podcasts. I really do believe it's true. It's been an hour and 45 minutes. And I really feel like we're warming up. I do. So in sake of your time, in sake of the listeners' time, what I think we should do is let's end here, and let's just do a part 2 sometime soon, and we can kind of start to flesh out. I don't know. I think the idea of agribusiness and its potential role in helping with the problems that we've identified here is interesting. I think it'll be a really good conversation, especially because it's so entirely nuanced. And right now it's the opposite. It's very streamlined. And so I think there's some conversations there. I also, I think the role of grain production in a local system like you have there is also a subject that I don't think we've beaten out enough. I think there's some more interesting nuance there that we can get into.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, I think, we'll just have to do this again.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Always glad to talk about this stuff, and yeah, looking forward to part 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Jeremy.